British Columbia Premier David Eby recently returned from a tour of Asia, proclaiming that Malaysia would be an excellent replacement for the trading issues that we were having with the United States. Somebody neglected to tell him that Malaysia just signed a deal with the United States. Welcome back to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. It is funny how the mainstream media has turned away from the trade delegation discussions and how they're no longer talking about how Mark Carney is going to somehow resolve this issue. Most of the world is able to hammer out a deal with Donald Trump, except Mark Carney either lacks the desire or the ability. There's no middle ground on that. It's got to be one or the other. Now they're trying to bring in a lot of hysteria with the, talking about fires and making people, fining people for walking in the woods, which I find to be very absurd. The narrative that comes out of the mainstream media is something that we have to be looking at here on the Canadian Shield. We have to start to discuss these issues, as I had mentioned earlier in a few episodes ago. I'm going to have to start tackling them because I guess somebody has to. One of those narratives, of course, is that oil is a horrible thing. Nobody in the world wants it. Stephen Guilbeault is trying to run up and down the country proclaiming that nobody in the world is interested in having oil, that the demand for oil is dropping. And it turns out that I have a couple of stories here that are put together show that there's might not necessarily be anything that Stephen Guilbeault is saying that has any accuracy to it. And I feel that if we are going to be electing this man to represent our interests in this country, they need to be honest. They need to be honorable. An honorable man is never dishonest. An honorable politician is also never dishonest. So if you're trying to craft a narrative for your particular ideology, you can say whatever you want about your motivation. However, as soon as it becomes dishonest, as soon as it deviates from the truth, you are no longer an honorable individual. That's just based on the understanding of the word. You might tell yourself that it's justifiable, but those are not the same thing. Now we're going to be diving into some oil around the globe right now so that we can try to understand just how much of the narrative coming out of our leaders might be skewed by their own particular desires and not necessarily putting the needs of our country to the forefront of that narrative. However, before I get into that, I would encourage you all to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this channel with all your socials. I really want to grow this channel. I really want to start to reach more people, more Canadians. And I often forget, I run a little banner on the bottom, but I often forget to say this at the beginning of every video. So like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. All links will be in the description. Many of you will remember that David Eby went to Asia recently and bought 4 ferries for British Columbia with secured loans from the Canadian government, well, for me and you, really. And then he also went through Malaysia, and he came back and he said, oh, Malaysia would be an excellent replacement for the United States in the terms of trade. At the time, I mentioned how that was just not the case. However, now we can see that Malaysia has decided to sign a trade deal that looks remarkably similar to the rest of the deals that the world is signing with the Americans. By that, I mean there are American products going into the country tariff-free, and there are products out of that country into America that are being charged a tariff, and Malaysia is no different. What's interesting to Canadians is one of the main parts of the trade deal was that Malaysia is going to be purchasing American LNG. Now, I remember when many people were calling, anybody who suggested Canadian LNG be exported to the world, they were calling them bad names. They were calling them climate deniers, which I don't even sure that that's a real word. But that's what they were saying in the very House of Commons when people would suggest that there was a big business market for LNG, specifically Pierre Poilievre's conservatives. Now that matters because all of you that told yourself you were voting against Donald Trump that are listening to my voice, that you were, going to take your support and move it away from the NDP and give it to the Liberal Party so that we would have a better standard of living, can realize that had this product be set up already, we could have satisfied the requirements of the LNG to many of the parts of the world that now other countries are filling that need. Rather than harp on that, however, we need to look at the idea that Malaysia, despite what the Liberal Party, despite what Julie de Bruzen and Stephen Guilbeault are trying to convince you of, most of Asia is after as much of this fossil fuel petroleum products that they can get their hands on. It's not a very long article, but I'll just say a couple of things out of it. Malaysia agrees to boost tech LNG purchases from the U.S. as part of a trade deal. So they're going to be buying LNG, they're going to be buying tech. Malaysia will spend up to $150 billion in the next 5 years to buy equipment from the U.S. multinationals for its semiconductor, aerospace, and data center sectors, part of a deal with Washington to cut tariffs, its trade minister said on Monday. The United States announced last week it would impose a 19% tariff on Malaysia starting August 8th, lower than the 25% threatened. So you see, he said 25%, and they sat down, they hammered out a deal, and one of the concessions that the United States made was to give them 6% less on the tariffs. Now that makes a lot of possibility for individuals that are manufacturing that might not have that. So, without being able to come all the way to the United States to manufacture a product, you might now be able to set up a business in Malaysia and save 6% on the tariffs. So that regionally, Malaysia is far away, right? So, I mean, that's something to think about also, right? How the benefits spiral out, right? Now, there's a lot of, they talk about the trade imbalance and all of that, but I want to come down to near the end where it says other concessions by Malaysia include reducing or abolishing duties on 98.4% of U.S. imports, easing some of the non-tariff barriers, and the removal of a requirement for U.S. social media platforms and cloud service providers to contribute part of their Malaysia revenue to a state fund, or what we're calling in Canada Bill C-18. So let's just recap. Not only has Malaysia agreed to buy $150 billion worth of products, primarily fossil fuels and semiconductors from the United States, they've agreed to anything that Malaysia wants to bring into the United States, they'll pay an additional 19% on. On top of all of that, they have decided to get rid of any of the tariffs of American products, while 98.4% of American products, which is much higher than what they can get tariff-free coming into Canada. And on top of all of that, they have decided to stop charging any of the tech companies that are based in the United States, which is probably most of them, a cut of revenue piece for any of the revenue generated inside of their country. So when you lay that up against the Liberal government claiming that the whole wide world doesn't want LNG or more fossil fuels, well, that was wrong. When you lay that up against the Liberal government claiming that the whole wide world charges the Americans digital sales tax, well, that was wrong. So if we on the one hand, we have two choices here. We can say that our Liberal government is intentionally trying to utilize the mainstream media, the corporate media, their bought and paid for media, to convince Canadians of things that aren't true, which could be considered quite dishonest. Or let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say they simply didn't know any better. They truly believed what they said. How, as a Canadian, is that good for us? On the one hand, they're being dishonest, or on the other hand, they have no idea what they're doing. We have to start to realize that what we need are people that know what they're doing and are honest. They have the ability to come to the microphone and say, man, I got no clue, but I'll look it up and I'll get back to you, which is exactly what you hear coming out of a man like Donald Trump, what you hear coming out of a man like Pierre Poilievre. You have to, any of you out there that still think that the Liberal Party is going to be the savior to us all, only has to look around and see the lack of productivity that comes out of that government. And ask yourself, why is that? Is it because of their desire to control us, or is it because they don't know any better? And how can either of those be any good for you and me? Many of you will remember when British Petroleum allowed that great oil spill in the what is today known as the Gulf of America. I mean, they made movies about it. It was a big deal. It was going on for a while. And as a result, British Petroleum decided that they were going to be moving out of that into renewables. So that move into renewables was not a very good move. And let's just look at an article that shows not only have they decided that that's not a good move, these renewables, but they've made one of the largest oil discoveries in recent memory. BP, British Petroleum, strikes major oil discovery offshore Brazil, its largest in decades. So now in the oceans off the coast of Brazil, they just found a whole bunch of oil. BP said Monday it has made its largest oil and gas discovery in 25 years in Brazil's Santos Basin, a so-called pre-salt area in deep water offshore, which is believed to be the largest reservoir of oil and gas. So they found this in deep water. Okay, that's like open ocean stuff, guys. That's like oil rigs that float, helicopters to get all the people back and forth. Same thing, you've seen it. BP returned its focus to fossil fuels last year to regain investor confidence and revive underperforming shares after a troubled push into renewable energy. They made this announcement and the value of their shares rose by 1.4%. A troubled push into renewable energy, of course, indicating that nobody on the world, A, wants it, and most importantly, this is what matters, it doesn't work. Right? What they have doesn't work. So, of course, you're not going to keep throwing good money after bad. BP, which has plans to grow its global oil and gas production to 2.3 to 2.5 million barrels a day by 2030. So I don't know how that meshes with Stephen Guilbeault's insistence that nobody in the world wants any oil because British Petroleum is increasing it to 2.5 million barrels a day. Said that this was the 10th discovery so far this year, following findings in Trinidad, Egypt, Brazil, and others. Oh, yeah. So what you want me to believe, now here's the thing that's going to make me laugh, is you want me to believe that people in Trinidad don't want oil revenue. I mean, let's be straightforward. That's an island nation now that has a natural resource off of its oceans, off of its coasts. That's a lot of jobs. I mean, island nations, they don't necessarily have a lot of natural resources because they're this big, right? I mean, Malaysia is another great example. But we have this British Petroleum, right? A government that's far left and claims that everything has to get all the steel out of their country, so on and so forth, wind turbines and all the rest of it. Meanwhile, countries like Norway, the Americans, everybody's making it hand over fist over this product because most of the world is still in, not only are they in demand for this product, but they're in ever increasing demands because as we give them the technology, as we give them the standard of living that they require, that they look at the Americas and say, hey, let's try to live like that. I mean, that's the thing that nobody wants to appreciate. If we simply exported the standard of living, nobody would want to come to America. Nobody would want to come to Europe. If we simply took the way that the government and the technology and the development works and pushed it down into the South, everybody down there would be like, I'm good, man. Everything is good. I'm living a middle-class lifestyle. I was born here. I'm happy here. Everything is wonderful. But they're not, because it isn't. And one of the biggest reasons that it isn't is because people like Stephen Guilbeault don't want to share the wealth, don't want to spread the help, don't want to do things that will increase the standard of living for not only Canadians, but the rest of the planet. And I ask you again, how is that good for me and you? No matter which way, even if he's just wholly incorrectly led astray. Though a man that climbs up on a house occupied by a woman to try and scare her because of oil production in the province doesn't make me think that he's necessarily been led astray. This sounds like he's the one that's making the mistake no matter which way you look at it. Nonetheless, I like to give the benefit of the doubt. If he's just wholly incorrect, I can't see how either of those examples, either of those situations are good for me and you. We hear a lot of talk about the barrel prices for oil, and we hear a lot of discussion about how, Alberta has so much of it and other sections of Canada have a lot of it. But we don't necessarily take a look at the difference between our product and the product in other parts of the world. And so this article says, now you know oil prices, Western Canada Select, which is what we call the stuff that comes out of the oil sands, Western Canada Select, versus West Texas Intermediate, which is what they call that comes out of down, in Texas. Texas has a lot of oil wells in it. And I would point out that the GDP of Texas, the state alone, far exceeds the national GDP for Canada. What is the difference and why is there a discount? So this article talks about the differences between the two products and why is it that the Western Canada Select is so much less money on the global stage. It's a good question. It's something Canadians need to know about because there are ways that we can increase that value if we were to get a government in place and a mindset of like, let's get some business in the ground, let's get some money manufactured. We could increase the value and we could increase the usage of Western Canada Select. Okay, so what are they? The West Texas Intermediate is a light sweet crude oil primarily produced in Texas and North Dakota, is the benchmark for U.S. oil pricing and traded in Cushing, Oklahoma. The fact that it's a low density, low sulfur, and is also the benchmark is something that Canadians have to consider because everything is measured against the benchmark, right? Now, Western Canadian Select is heavy, sour crude oil, meaning it's very thick and it has a lot of sulfur. And that's kind of okay for us because sulfur is used in a lot of other things, including fertilizer, including fireworks. Now, there are worse things than to be the country that manufactures the world's best fertilizer and the world's best pyrotechnics. Produced in Alberta's oil sands, benchmark for Canadian heavy crude pricing, blend of bitumen, conventional heavy oil, and a diluent to make it transportable. So here they explain why you get $15 to $20 less or $10 to $20 less per barrel. The quality discount, heavy sour crude requires more complex refining, coking units, desulfurization to produce gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Refines incur higher processing costs and fewer high-value products per barrel. Because the West Texas stuff can go into a car as it sits, and the Western Canada stuff cannot. However, the Western Canada stuff is much better for strong engines like oil tankers and ships and locomotives. And so all these industrial uses are much better for the heavier product, right? Or the more dense, what they're calling. The transportation restraints. Now, this is the one we need to hear, you and I as Canadians. Western Canada Select is landlocked. Landlocked. Because we don't have any pipelines to get it out of the way. Geez, I wonder whose fault that is. Must be shipped via pipeline or rail to the U.S. refineries, mainly in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast. Why don't we have those refineries right in Canada? Why do we not have those refineries built inside of Canada is something we need to ask Stephen Guilbeault and the government about and how they got in the way of all of the refineries for our specific crude. But in America, there's I think 11 various refineries that will handle our crude. Pipeline capacity limits causes bottlenecks, increases shipping costs, and widening the discount. So because we don't have enough pipelines, we don't get as much money for our product. Market access. Fewer refineries are configured to process heavy crude. Again, why don't we have them in Canada? That's the nature of our oil. We should have the nature of the refinery and then build the pipeline. Western Canada Select depends heavily on U.S. buyers, making it vulnerable to changes in U.S. demand because we don't have any other markets. Maintenance season at refineries can temporarily reduce demand. Regulatory changes. Oh, regulatory changes. They literally mention Keystone XL's cancellation can affect supply routes. They have competition from Venezuela. Isn't Venezuela a dictatorship? Isn't Venezuela a dictatorship that oppresses free speech? And so when you hear Pierre Poilievre say we could be taking money away from dictators, when you don't support that, what you're actually doing is supporting the dictatorship of Venezuela. Now, this article goes on to say one other thing. And again, I'll leave a link in the description. When the discount widens or narrows, it narrows when pipeline capacity increases, demand for heavy crude rises, heavy crude supplies elsewhere falls. It widens when pipeline congestion worsens, oil sand output surges, U.S. refinery shortages occur, and global demand for heavy crude oil drops. Now, we can control the market for oil is controlled all the time. OPEC always announces whether they're making more or less. But OPEC has a very sweet crude as well. It's very light. What I'm wanting you to hear is that if we have more pipelines, we get more money for our product. If we have refineries that handle our product and we don't have to ship it as far as expensively, we get more money for our product. All of these are jobs that I'm talking about. Strong, good collar, blue collar working jobs that will have little towns built up around it, that will make people happy. They'll go hunting, they'll go fishing, they'll do all of the things that I get that the liberal government and many of the people on the far left just are terrified of, but most of the world dreams of. Like, it's not like the people that are looking at the Western countries are looking at it and saying, geez, I can't wait to move to New York and live in a high rise. But I promise you, they're all looking at those rivers and thinking, man, that would be amazing. I would love to be able to go there on the weekend and go to work all week and then go away for the weekend to something like that, to the beach and all of those kinds of images. I know that because I've spoken to lots of people from other different countries because I'm a Canadian and I've been all over the place in this country. And no matter where you go in this country, you can find somebody that's from somewhere else. And that's great. That's wonderful. And that's spectacular. But I don't believe for one second that they're living in other countries saying, let's move to Canada so I don't make any money. Let's move to Canada so that I will not be able to ever own a house. What we have is a product that the entire world wants, and we have a formula for why our product is not necessarily as easily received on the world stage, because we have a bottlenecking, because we have heavy crude, and because we have a government that is not supportive of industry. And again, I ask you, how is voting against Donald Trump helping me and you? How is keeping a government in place that is fanatical, driven by things that are not good for the betterment and the overall wealth and prosperity of Canadians? How is it better keeping them in power? How is it better giving them your vote? How is it better for you personally, giving them your support? I just want you to ask yourself that question. Because in the end, I can't see, no matter no matter what group you belong to, whether you want to break yourself down into like a tiny little group over here in the corner where, you under all the identity politics, or if you just tell yourself, no, I'm good, I'm right here, I'm a Canadian, like in the larger overscale of things, where in there do you tell yourself that you don't need any money and being poor is better for you? All right. You can let me know down in the comments. I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.